So I have a 2011 Toyota RAV4. That is my daily driver, and that is my adventure mobile that I've spent probably a good year of my life in. I spend 2 or 3 months a year camped in it, and I've had it for about 5 years. So I've had it for a while now, and I've spent a lot of time in it. A RAV4 is a pretty small SUV. They don't really come much smaller than that. And then I also have experience with this guy. This is a Suburban. This particular model is a 1993. I've also had experience with a 2003, I think, 2003. These Suburbans have been loaned to me by Grady from Suburban, which is a company that, well, that turns Suburbans into off-roading adventure vehicles, 4x4 adventure vehicles that you can sleep in. So I have experience with something on this very small end of the SUV size spectrum, the RAV4, and I have experience with these guys, which are on the other end of the SUV size spectrum. I'm on the tail end of a 10-day trip with this guy. And so the question is, which is better? A big SUV or a small SUV for your SUV RVing adventures, your camping adventures in an SUV? So that's what this video is going to be all about. I'm going to give you the pros and cons of each. It's starting to snow a little bit more. Let's get inside the Suburban here where it's warmer. I'll turn the engine off and we can chat inside there. And I want to note here that although my channel is based on camping and traveling and sleeping in SUVs, this applies to any kind of vehicle. It applies to cars, it applies to vans, it applies to trucks, it applies to RVs. So I'm going to be framing this in the world of SUVs, but really it applies to all classes of vehicles. So the pros of a big SUV, let's start there. Start with this guy. More space is the first one that comes to mind. That's the really big one. That's the obvious one, right? More space. But what can you do with that more space? What does it mean to have more space, and why is that valuable? I think there are really 3 parts to that. The first is that there's more space for you inside. There's more space for you, your partner, your pet, your family. There's more room for the people that'll be camping in here, right? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. There's also more room for storage. So food, supplies, water, gear, all of that stuff. There's more room for that, and so you're not, you know, it's not all piled on top of you like it could be in a small SUV. And things like your battery bank and your fridge, it can be hard to figure out places to put those in a small SUV. You have much more room in a big SUV to put those. So for example, here, there's the bed back there, and then between the edge of the bed and the seats right here, there's a good, I don't know, 2.5 feet of space, 2.5 or 3 feet of space. It's just empty space. And so that's where the fridge is. The fridge is right here, and the battery bank is right here. And so plenty of room for all of that kind of thing. And then third, there's more room for a build. And so if you want to do things like this, if you want to add, you know, a wooden ceiling, if you want to add things like, you see this, like these cabinets here, the cubbies, there's more room for that. Because some of that stuff does take up space, and if you have more space to start with, you can add things like that, and it doesn't encroach on your space entirely. You know, you're not ending up with a space this big around for you to sleep in. Another pro of a big SUV kind of goes along with that, in that it can be more self-sustained on the inside. So what I mean by that is that if you have a small SUV, you might not have room for all of your stuff inside. And so you might have to add your stuff outside. So on top of the vehicle, off the back of the vehicle, through like a, you know, one of those hitch-mounted platforms or baskets. A lot of people who have big SUVs still do add things to the outside because they can, and there's nothing wrong with that. But with a smaller SUV, that's something that you kind of almost have to do, depending on how much stuff you have, depending on how many people are camping with you. With a big SUV, you don't necessarily need to do that. Like with this Suburban, I think my wife and I could both camp in here, and we wouldn't need to add like a cargo box to the roof, for example. We still might, because it can be easier, just can be more convenient to put like bulky things up there so they're not inside here. But it's not something you need to do with a big vehicle like this. And then another pro of this kind of vehicle, a bigger vehicle, is that it's kind of more fun to be in when you're driving. Now, that's different from it's more fun to drive, because this thing, I mean, it's not really more fun to drive, it's more work to drive a big vehicle like this. And just for reference, this one has a lift on it, has bigger tires, so I'm up higher, and it's just a big vehicle, right? And so when you're going down the road, you feel like a king in this thing. You know, you're driving down the road and you're surveying the land. It's pretty great. It's fun to be up high in something like this. It's fun to just have a big long vehicle. It's just fun to kind of be in something like this. But again, it's not more fun to drive necessarily. It's just a fun kind of novelty thing, because most of us don't have vehicles this big. We're not used to having vehicles this big. But it is kind of a novelty these days, you know? And then one thing I didn't really talk about with regards to more space, it can just be more pleasant to hang around in a vehicle that has more space to it. You're not cramped, you can kind of stretch out. Like, you can sit on the edge of the bed here with your feet down in this area where there's a lot of space. You can stretch out more, you don't necessarily feel like you're confined into a tiny space. You don't feel like you're in a coffin, you know? So if you like more space around you when you're sleeping, or just when you're, you know, hanging out in the vehicle, then a big SUV is one to consider, obviously. Now, that's not to say that you necessarily will have more space, especially back in the sleeping area. So when you have a big SUV, you're tempted to make use of that space, obviously, which is fine, which is great, which is one of the reasons you got a big SUV. But when you use up that space, you might end up with less space, actually, than you would with a smaller rig. So let me give you an example here. So there's the bed back here is on a platform about this high, and there are shelves under it, right? Pretty common setup in rigs like this. But what that means is that it eats up into your headroom. And so back there, you can't quite sit up straight, right? Like with your legs out and your legs like this and your back like this, you can't sit up completely. You have to kind of hunch over a little bit. In my RAV4, there's not really enough room. There's not enough space to build a platform. Now, I know people do build platforms in their smaller SUVs, which is fine. And of course, you're going to have even less headroom there. But I don't have a platform built in my RAV4, and as a result, I can actually sit up fully when I'm in the back, when I'm on the bed area. And so, in one sense, I have more space there because I wasn't tempted to build a platform, and so I have the full height of the vehicle to sit up in. Another kind of a pro of big SUVs is that they tend to be more off-road capable, but really for any rig, you're going to need to make modifications to it to be a truly good off-road rig. The Suburban, for example, has I think a 2.5-inch lift and big tires. That makes this an excellent off-road vehicle. Also, it's 4-wheel drive, and so this is great for going off-road. My RAV4 is also 4-wheel drive, but it doesn't have nearly as much clearance as something like this. But it does have better attack angles, so like there's not as much car hanging off behind the wheels or in front of the wheels in the front, or behind the wheels in the back. And so when I'm going down into a dip, for example, something like my RAV4, which is very compact, can do better than something like this that is much longer. And so you can't really say definitively that a big SUV is better than a small SUV for off-roading, because again, you can make modifications. But in general, a big SUV is more amenable to those modifications. So if you want to add a lift to your rig, if you do want to add bigger tires, you're probably going to want to do that to a medium or big vehicle, to your Jeep, your 4Runner, or your Suburban. There are more options for things like that for a bigger rig than a smaller one. And now let's talk about the pros of a smaller SUV. So the big one for me is fuel efficiency. Gas mileage. It's just cheaper to go on trips, it's cheaper to drive, it's cheaper to run day to day as a daily driver. So this thing, I think, gets about 14 miles to the gallon, this Suburban. The last one that I borrowed got between 12 and 13 miles to the gallon. My RAV4, ostensibly on the highway, it gets, 26 to 31, but with the cargo box on top and with all my stuff in it, and when I'm idling in the morning, warming up the car, overall on a trip of like 2 weeks, I'll get about 25 miles per gallon, 24 and a half, 25 miles per gallon on average. And so if you do the math, which is not difficult, I get about twice the fuel efficiency in the RAV4 compared to one of these things, more or less. And so practically speaking, it'll be twice as expensive gas-wise to travel in one of these things. Now that may or may not matter to you. I mean, it should matter to everyone from like an environment standpoint, from a health of the planet standpoint, as far as, you know, burning up fossil fuels and all that stuff, but I'm not really going to get into that. Just as far as pure fuel economy and how much it costs to run one of these. If you're short on cash, then one of these bigger rigs will put a strain on your wallet. Let's say a trip in my RAV4 costs $150 in gas over a week. It'll cost $300 in gas in one of these. Or if it costs $400 in gas in the RAV4, if I go on a longer trip, it'll cost $800 in one of these. And that's getting into some pretty serious savings with a smaller vehicle. You know, you could do a lot with an extra $400. And so if you're on a fixed budget with a smaller vehicle, you can go on either twice the number of trips, or you can go on longer trips. You know, it's just, you just have more options financially if you have a smaller vehicle. Another huge pro of a smaller SUV is that it's just much more maneuverable. It's easier to drive, just day to day. You know, on a mountain road, it's easier. When you're changing lanes, it's easier. It's easier to turn around. It's easier to find places to park. It's easier to stop. Like, this thing weighs so much, you know, it takes much longer to come to a stop than my RAV4. And there have been a lot of times when I'll be driving in this, and I'll be going down like a small road in the mountains, and I'll pass a turnoff on the side. And in my RAV4, or like I see one coming up, in my RAV4, I have enough time to stop and then go down that road. In this, I've found that by the time I stop, I'm past that road, so I have to back up and then turn onto that road, if I can. You know, if it's like a legit paved road, I need to keep going down until I can find a turnaround and then go back. And so that is noticeable. I think that is probably the most, apart from gas, that is the most noticeable feature of having a small vehicle. It is just so much easier and less stressful to drive. And then again, on those small roads, when I'm trying to turn around, like if I'm on a small mountain road looking for a campsite, and I've decided that this area isn't a good candidate for camping in, for whatever reason, like I'm not seeing any campsites and I need to turn around. If I'm in this on a small mountain road, I mean, it can be impossible to do like a many point turn and then go back. And so I basically need to either reverse my way back down or keep going until I can find another spot to turn around in. In my RAV4, I can basically do like a 3, 4, 5, 6 point turn, however many turns it takes, and I can turn around on basically the narrowest of roads, and that's not an issue. And that is, in practice, that is actually a very valuable thing to have. And then yeah, with parking, you know, in small parking lots, it really is just much easier to park a small rig. With this, like, you're bigger than a regular car, you're smaller than an RV, so you don't really want to take up the RV parking if there is some, like at a beach parking lot, for example, and at a parking lot for a small beach. You don't want to take up the RV parking, and so, you know, it can be hard to park this thing sometimes. If you're in a big parking lot for like a Walmart or a grocery store, it doesn't matter. You can just park farther out and, you know, it's not a problem. But for smaller parking lots, it can be an issue. And the same goes, obviously, when you're backing out of a parking spot. If you're in a compact little trailhead parking area, for example, and you're backing out and you need to turn, you know, you're getting close to the cars on the other side. So it's just way easier to overall drive a smaller vehicle, to park it, maneuver it, stop it, turn it. Everything is easier about a smaller vehicle. And remember how I said that a big rig is more fun to be in? A smaller rig, for me, is just more fun to drive. Like the actual driving part of it, it's much more nimble. It just feels more fun. And it's also less stressful to drive. Something like this, like I said, it's work to drive this rig. It's a little bit stressful to drive this rig. You just have to be more aware of your surroundings. When you're changing lanes, you have to be doubly sure that there's enough room, you know, between the cars to fit in there. And smaller rigs are just more carefree, just more enjoyable to drive. And again, that'll translate to a day-to-day basis if you're driving it as your daily driver. The last thing I wanted to talk about really is that it's easier to find a flat campsite when you have a smaller vehicle. So on a Suburban, let's say the wheelbase, the distance between the wheels is this much. With a RAV4, it's not going to be half, but it's going to be significantly smaller. So if this is the RAV4 and this is the Suburban, it's much easier to find a piece of flat ground in the mountains especially that's this wide, that's this long, compared to this long. Now if you're camping in like Kansas, yeah, I don't think it's probably that much of an issue because Kansas is very flat. But for me, I camp and travel a lot in the mountains, and it's noticeably more difficult to find a flat spot or to get a completely flat spot for this rig than it is for my RAV4. And it's the same thing width-wise. Like this is a wider vehicle than my RAV4, and so you need to find a flat spot that's not only this long, but that's also this wide for this vehicle. And so it's just more tricky. You know, it takes more turning around once you find a campsite to like say, okay, if I come at it from this angle, is it more flat? If I come at it from this angle, is it more flat? It's just something that takes a bit more work to deal with. And it is a noticeable thing. Like that was one of the first things that surprised me when I borrowed one of these, is that it's like, wow, I really have to think more about where I'm going to camp here. With my RAV4, I can basically just, you know, go anywhere and find a level spot, but you wouldn't think it would be a huge deal with something a little bit bigger like this, but it's a big deal. And so that's my summary of the pros and cons of a big SUV versus a small SUV. And again, this can apply to any vehicle, but of course, it's not so black and white, right? It's not just a RAV4 versus a Suburban. There's a spectrum there. There are lots of vehicles that are in between a RAV4 and a Suburban. And so some of these pros and cons, they might still exist, but maybe it'll be toward this end of the spectrum. It won't be as strong, or maybe it'll be at this end of the spectrum. You know what I mean? It might not make as big of a difference. And so I suggest that if you're searching for a vehicle to turn into a camper, to turn into an SUV, RVing, adventure mobile, consider what your priorities are. Is space and storage your priority? Okay, then you're going to want to get something big, obviously. Like, don't get a Suburban. I mean, don't get a RAV4. Similarly, if gas mileage is your #1 priority, don't get a 15-year-old Suburban. And then the same thing will apply to a 4Runner. Don't get a 4Runner if fuel efficiency is your top priority. I get emails from people every so often, and they're like, okay, I want a big SUV, I want it to have great gas mileage, and I want it to be super cheap. And sorry to break it to you, but that vehicle does not exist. And so you're gonna have to have some give in your plans somewhere. Sometimes you can get 1 or 2 of those things, but having all 3 is just not an option. As for me and what I personally prefer, so I really like my RAV4. It's great for me. It's less great when my wife comes with me. And so, you know, that's a trade-off. If you sometimes camp by yourself, if you sometimes camp with other people, you know, you're gonna have to take that into consideration when you're planning what rig you're gonna get. But I don't think there's a wrong answer here. Like, this Suburban is a lot of fun and it's great, and I'm thinking of getting one. My RAV4 is also great. To some extent, it really doesn't matter what kind of vehicle you have. You'll make it work and you're gonna have fun in it. But if you are, you know, at the start of this journey, if you are thinking of something to get, you don't already have a vehicle, then these are some things to take into consideration. It really just depends on what your priorities are. That's really what it comes down to. I'm interested in hearing what you guys think. What are some other pros and cons of having a big versus a small vehicle? Are there things that I didn't think of? Are there things that you've noticed in your travels in your big or small or medium-sized SUV? Let me know. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a like on YouTube. And if you want to see more SUV camping content, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Be sure to check out Adventure Know-How, my new site, where you can gain access to a map of all of my free campsites, plus monthly bonus videos that you won't find anywhere else. Learn more at adventureknowhow.com. And for links to everything else SUV RVing related, visit suvrving.com. Links to these sites and more will be in the video description.